Hi everyone, it's Jakov, and due to the new version of Last Alliance Total War being released, I'm here with the new video breaking down the newest faction added to the mod, the Kingdom of Ered Luin. If you're new here, Last Alliance Total War is a mod for Total War Shogun 2 set in the Second Age of Middle-earth, being somewhat of a prequel timeline-wise to Total War The Dawnless Days, a mod for Total War Attila set in the Third Age instead. As of making this video, the mod is in development, being in the version 0.3.2 alpha. Well, that's somewhat early in the mod's development. There's still a fair bit of content in the mod with several factions and a small campaign being ready to play. For those of you interested in the mod, I'm going to leave it linked in the description, and I do encourage you to play. Today's video, as I said, will be a faction breakdown, with me going over the history within both the books and films of Tolkien's universe of the Kingdom of Ered Luin before looking at the civilizations that inspired it in real life. After that, I'm going to look at the faction's units and break them down, covering their battlefield roles as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic it is. However, before we begin covering said faction, it's important that I note that as of this update, a previous faction which I did a video on has been renamed, the Orcs of the Misty Mountains becoming the Orcs of the North. While that might not seem like much of a change, that faction has also had a new unit added to it. Rather than completely remake that video just to cover one additional unit, instead I'm going to cover that unit in this video as a bit of an entree before the main course. The new unit added to the Orcs of the North is a unit of Orc sword infantry called the Uruk Butchers of Angmar, Angmar being an ancient evil fortress in northern Middle-earth controlled by the leader of the Nazgul, the ring wraith known as the Witch King of Angmar. Looking at their armour, these orcs are equipped almost identically to the elite orc units of their faction, wearing short mail or scale hauberks over which they have cuirasses of plate, the upper legs being protected by folds while the lower legs are protected by greaves and sabatons, the arms having spolders and vambraces for protection. Over their chests, they to an orc have what appears to be bearskins or wolfskins, such items commonly being worn by warriors in cold environments, although for comfort or status reasons rather than for protection, fur providing little in the way of defensive properties. The most visually striking aspect, however, are their helmets, which resemble Corinthian helmets mixed with flat-topped great helms with a spiked brow. The aesthetic greatly reminiscent of the helmet of the Witch King of Angmar who these troops are attempting to emulate. For shields, they use metal bucklers straight out of the 14th century, while for weapons, they use one-handed warhammers with heads designed to look like snakes, and a hook on the back of the weapon for dragging enemies and a spike atop it for stabbing them, the weapon not being too dissimilar from late medieval examples. Turning to the officer, he is equipped identically to his men except that his helmet has an attached crest reminiscent of the crests used by Roman centurions, this crest however being made of spiked metal. The helmets overall also resemble somewhat those used by the Orcs of Dol Guldur in the Hobbit films, which makes sense given that those orcs are also of the north and aligned with an ancient evil fortress. As a unit, these Uruk Butchers of Angmar are elite warriors who are more of a match for the professional infantry fielded by the Free Peoples, giving the Orcs of the North the strength to stand toe-to-toe with most foes. I'd recommend recruiting as many of these guys as possible given that they are truly a useful unit. With all that said, let's move on to the main point of this video, the Kingdom of Ered Luin. First, let's start by going on a general overview of it. Ered Luin, otherwise known as the Blue Mountains, were a mountain range in the far west of Middle-earth, the homelands of two of the great dwarven lines, the Firebeards and the Broadbeams, who would build the ancient dwarven citadels of Nogrod and Belagost in the years of the trees before the First Age. At the end of the First Age, the Blue Mountains were mostly destroyed by the reshaping of Middle-earth, leading many of the dwarves residing there to migrate to Khazad-dûm, although some dwarves would reside there all the way to the Third Age. The history of the region mostly being skipped over when it came to the Second Age that this mod is set in. During the Third Age, the people of Erebor would flee to Ered Luin to escape the fall of the Lonely Mountain to Smaug, with King Thorin initially ruling over the region before the successful retaking of the Lonely Mountain. As I said before, little is known about the history of this region and its dwarven inhabitants during the Second Age, the only thing that we really know being that apart from the Longbeard tribe of Khazad-dûm, few dwarves fought in the War of the Last Alliance, so we can assume that some dwarves of Ered Luin took up arms, but only a small minority. Ered Luin doesn't really appear prominently in the Hobbit books or movies, only ever being referred to as a place that the dwarves of Erebor have rebuilt their lives or in the Lord of the Rings books and films. The region is almost entirely skipped over, which makes sense given that the War of the Ring didn't have a direct impact on the area similar to the War of the Last Alliance. While little of the region has been seen, perhaps with the new Amazon show The Rings of Power, a closer look at Ered Luin and the dwarves who inhabit the region will be gained. In terms of cultures which may have inspired the dwarves of Ered Luin, while I can't think of any outstanding examples that correlate perfectly, the widespread Iron Age miners of Britain stand out to me much the same as they did in correlation with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, this culture most likely being one that Tolkien, given his historical knowledge about the British Isles, would have known about, although the relative neutrality of the dwarves and conflicts in Middle-earth is reminiscent of Switzerland, the tenuous connection between the two growing stronger when you realise just how mountainous Switzerland is. With the history of the faction both in and out of the universe looked at, let's move on to the units themselves. Unlike the Dawnless Days in which generals can sometimes be more elite units that can be used multiple times in one army, the generals in this mod are unique, with each faction generally only having two generals, the Kingdom of Ered Luin however having three general options. The first of these three options are the Ered Luin Blue Guard, who are your standard general. Looking at the dwarves, they're heavily armoured, wearing skullcap helmets with crosspiece ridges designed to add strength and rigidity, similar to early medieval Spangan helms, which it resembles, having a male avatar to protect the back of the neck, much like the real-life examples, with a faceplate incorporating a nose guard and a cheek guard reminiscent of early examples of medieval enclosed helmets before the creation of great helms. These helmets in particular are gilded and enamelled in blue, helping to show off the high status of the unit, the blue colour being a motif of the dwarves of the Blue Mountain, while the artistry of the helmets is something seen in real-life examples of helmets used by high-class warriors. For body armour, these dwarves wear a knee-length tunic over which they have a mail hauberk, over which they have a plate cuirass designed to appear as if it's made of segmented bands of bare steel and enamelled metal, separated by fancy gilding, while the folds protecting the upper legs over the top of the hauberk shares the same pattern but exactly segmented, the armour looking like it could have potentially been filled in the 16th century. Protecting their arms, the dwarves have pauldrons and spaulders with the same pattern as do their vambraces, while their shins are protected by greaves and their feet blocky sabatons. For shields, these are a large round wooden affair covered in a layer of metal designed to look like mountains, with a centre boss in the middle, some of the shields being partially enamelled. The shields reminiscent of a fusion between ancient Greek hoplons and the stereotypical Viking shield, these shields having a metal rim which I'm pretty sure their historical counterparts lacked. Alongside their shields, these dwarves use arming swords with gilded crosspieces and pommels that look like they came out of the 12th century. While the weapons and the shields look nice, the truth is that they don't really make much sense given that these dwarves are this heavily armoured. A shield could easily be dropped in a two-handed weapon used instead to devastating effect, given that such a sword wouldn't do much against heavily armoured foes. Looking at the unit officer, he's identical to his men except that his helmet, aventail, is scaled instead of mail, and his helmet is far more decorated, having a blue horsehair crest on it similar to those used by ancient Greek hoplites, while the helmet is way more gilded and enamelled than anyone else's in the unit. As a unit, these guys are your basic midpoint general, having good offensive abilities, while also being very well armoured, making them well-rounded but not really a standout unit. That said, these guys should do well in most battle situations, especially when kept in reserve as a mobile shield war. Moving on to the second general option for the faction, we have Thrain the Second Stonefist leading the Firebeard's Guard, the Firebeards being one of the two main groups of dwarves residing in the Ered Luin. Looking at the unit, they're equipped identically to the previous unit when it comes to armour, but differ in their equipment, dropping shields and arming swords to instead wield massive two-handed swords which look to be inspired with the medieval Zweihander of the German states. Such weapons see in common use in the late 15th and 16th centuries. These weapons in particular appear to have long hilts necessary for counterbalancing the long weapon, the grips being made of blue leather, leather being a common material used for swords. This weapon makes way more sense for the unit as it allows their armour to shrug off blows while they return devastating strikes on their enemies. Turning to Thrain the Second himself, he wears a helmet much like that of the previous unit officer, except that the faceplate is almost entirely enamelled and gilded, while the helmet is capped off with metal in the shape of a crown that is also gilded, Thrain essentially having a crown helmet that shows off his role as a king. As a unit, these guys are the shock infantry counterpart of the Ered Luin Blue Guard. These warriors are being designed to hit hard and fast, something they excel at, being capable of tearing even resolute enemy formations to pieces. However, the unit isn't quite as well rounded as the previous one, which means in defensive situations, these guys might not be the best choice, especially when it comes to holding the line. But for breaching the line, these guys are some of the best in the mod, being more expensive as a result than the standard general unit fielded by the faction. Next up, we have the final general option available to the dwarves of Ered Luin, Azargal the Third leading the Broadbeam's Guard. Looking at these dwarves, they appear similar but not identical to the previous units. For helmets, rather than Spangan helm derivatives, they use skullcaps with face masks, the helmets overall resembling the typical Viking helmet with incredibly intricate gilding, the rest of the look being finished off with a scale aventail and standard. Skipping the rest of their armour which we've seen before, there's the same round shields as the Ered Luin Blue Guard except that these shields are enamelled to some degree, while for weapons they use one-handed axes with back spikes and metal shafts, the gilded weapons looking like those used in the 16th century by both Western heavy cavalry and Persian cavalry, such axes being great for running down infantry while on horseback, although on foot it could still be very dangerous. Looking at the officer, he's identical to his men except that he wears a gilded helmet reminiscent of a great helm, which has been topped with a gilded dragon as a crest. Highly ornate crests were worn by warriors historically, though generally for display rather than for use in combat, the most battle they'd normally see being in jousts. The helmet looks amazing and overall helps set the king apart from his forces. As a unit, these guys have a good balance of the previous units, definitely being a more offensive-oriented unit with their choice of weapon while also being more defensive due to actually being able to use a shield and go into formation. Tied with the previous unit for the most expensive unit in the faction roster, I say these guys are probably the best general Ered Luin can field, however in most cases they won't really be necessary, but when they are, you'll be glad you have them, even if cavalry can be a distinct threat. With these guys covered, let's move on to the first of the spear units the faction can field, beginning with their lowliest, the Ered Luin's Path Scarred. These dwarves are relatively well armoured for troops of such low status, each dwarf having a more basic version of the previously seen helmets with mail aventails, though even these are gilded or variously decorated, the cheek guards being less protective on these versions. To protect their torso, they all wear a gambeson, a form of padded textile armour which saw widespread use in the Middle Ages, with some in the unit wearing mail shirts over them, such a thing being commonly done historically. Apart from this, the dwarves lack armour, only having leather boots which are shod in steel, equivalent to modern-day steel cap boots. For equipment, these dwarves use metal-rimmed shields that look very much like the pavese shields used in the late Middle Ages. Such shields commonly seen use among lesser infantry who couldn't afford extensive plate harnesses. These paveses are enamelled and then gilded, something that was done historically, but only by the most wealthy individuals. These shields showing off in the mod that even the lowest of the warriors in the Ered Luin have easy access to precious metals. The rim on the shield is also historical, as rims on paveses were a real thing. For weapons, the Ered Luin Pass Guard have at their side single-headed axes in case of melee, but their main weapons are spears, in particular spears with langlets and wings that look very much to be inspired by the winged spears of the 11th and 12th centuries, the attachment to the shaft preventing bodies from being pierced too deeply. Turning to the unit officer, he wears a more elaborate helmet with a blue horsehair crest, while his body is protected by a mail hauberk as well as plate van braces and greaves, using the same shield and spears as men. As a unit, these guys are your early building blocks of your army, being the unit that helps hold the line where your offensive infantry tear apart enemy formations. The unit also being useful at fending off cavalry attacks, but they are useful in an early game unit. They are again an early game unit, and as such, I recommend phasing them out once better units become available. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Ered Luin Gate Guard, which are also the only other spear unit the faction has access to. For armour, these guys uniformly wear mail hauberks over which they have blue surcoats. Their helmets similar to the previous ones except that they seem to have somewhat of a central ridge. In addition to their hauberks, these troops have pauldrons and spaulders for the upper arms, as well as van braces, greaves and sabatons, all looking like equipment out of the late 15th century. Unlike the previous unit, these guys discard shields and instead choose to use halberds as their main tool. Many of the second tier spear units in the game also making the choice to get rid of shields, this trend being seen in the Kingdom of Khazad-dûm roster as well as the Haradrim tribes. These halberds in question look like the larger versions of the weapon which saw use in the 15th and 16th centuries, having back spikes, axe blades and spear points or to dispatch enemies, the shafts having metal langlets for extra strength and rigidity. For troops of this armor level, the weapon is an alright choice as it does allow them to form up in close ranks and present a spear war, although due to lacking shields they can't absorb punishment anywhere near as much as they potentially could. Looking at the officer, he looks like the Ered Luin Blue Guard troops in appearance with a blue crested helmet and a sword for use in conjunction with his shield. They're very much what we've seen before. As a unit, these guys are far more effective than the previous unit and should be recruited when possible so as to be the core of your spear line if defensive strategies are chosen. These guys being your premier answer to enemy horsemen who they will slaughter. A highly useful unit, these guys will see service all the way into elite armies, so how extensive that service will be depends on how close to the faction's intended playstyle you go. Moving on to the sword infantry of the faction, we arrive at the first example capable of being fielded, the Ered Luin Tunnel Guard. Armour-wise, these dwarves wear the same helmet as the Ered Luin Gate Guard, although for body armour they wear a mix of mail and scale hauberks as well as greaves and van braces. Using the same Rodolero shields and arming swords as the Ered Luin Blue Guard, the unit officer is identical to the previous one. As a unit, these guys are your starting sword infantry and as such are very useful at cutting through the rabble that they'll be expected to face, working well in tandem with the Ered Luin Path's Guard. While they are useful on the battlefield, however, I'd argue that the faction has access to a better unit that shares much the same role in the same part of the game. However, that unit better matches the aggressive nature of the Kingdom of Ered Luin, this unit somewhat being a more balanced option, which is a good thing as battlefield flexibility is a must for any prospective general. That said, sometimes it's better to go with the grain than against it, and I'll bring up that idea when we get to that particular unit. Next up, we have the Ered Luin Berserkers, who are fairly lightly armoured, wearing gambeson in combination with mail vests in addition to greaves and van braces. For helmets, they have a mix of Viking-inspired helmets with face masks attached to which are mail hoods, completely protecting the face, giving the unit a very Varangian or Kievan Rus appearance. Some in the unit instead wear helmets that very much resemble the ray skullcap helmets used by early Crusaders as a development of the iconic Norman nasal helm. Discarding shields, these troops instead wield the Zweihander sword seen previously. Such weapons are mainly seeing use in the hands of shock troops designed to break up pike blocks, much the same way these warriors are meant to break up infantry formations. Turning to the officer, he's mostly identical to his men except for his more ornate crested helmet and his pauldrons and spaulders. As a unit, these guys are mid-tier shock infantry who excel at carving up opposition, this unit alone helping to differentiate the dwarves of Ered Luin from their kin in Khazad-dûm, this unit being a swift attacker designed to end battle quickly rather than grinding down foes as the typical dwarven fashion. A very useful unit, these guys shouldn't be used in moderation like most armies, and should instead be a core component of your forces used in large enough numbers to drown enemies in screaming berserkers. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Ered Luin warriors, who wear the same armor as the Ered Luin tunnel guard, but instead use smaller boss enamel shields akin to larger bucklers, in conjunction with the axes used by the Firebeard's guard general unit. Officer-wise, led by a dwarf armored identically to the tunnel guard officer, uses the same shield and axes as men. As a unit, these are the guys who are referred to as being the better versions of the Ered Luin tunnel guard, as this unit is more offensive as indicated by the weapon of choice and smaller shields, having Slash to show off this preference for attacking rather than defending, meaning that these guys work amazingly well in tandem with the Berserkers, providing you with a fairly resilient line in the mid-game that can pivot between going on the offensive and holding off foes, although not quite as good at defending as the tunnel guard. Overall, whichever unit you choose, either will serve you well. It is a case of acknowledging which is better for what potential scenario. Defending fortifications, the Tunnel Guard. Attacking them, the Ered Luin Warriors. Overall, a crucial component of any army fielded by this faction. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Ered Luin Royal Swordsmen. A step up from the previous units, these dwarves are as heavily armed as the Ered Luin Blue Guard, sharing the same armor, shields and swords, though their equipment is a bit less ornate, skipping their officer who's differentiated by his crest. These guys are your standard high-tier professional infantry who will most likely make up the core of your late-game army, easily standing toe-to-toe with the elite infantry fielded by elves and men, and are more than being a match for the tougher orc units in the mod. An additional skill these troops have is their axe throwing abilities, meaning that they can skirmish with enemy forces before closing in on them. A great advantage which not many equivalent units have access to. Overall, a very useful unit and one which is very much exemplifies the hard-hitting nature of this faction. Next up, we have the Ered Luin Belagos Shield Bearers, who for all intents and purposes are the Broadbeam Guard led by Azurgal III, except that they use swords instead of axes and are led by an officer with a horsehair crest helmet rather than a king with a crowned helmet. As a unit, these guys are stronger in melee than the previous unit but lack skirmish capabilities, evening out the two. In my personal opinion, I take the Royal Swordsmen over these guys for the flexibility they bring to your armies, this unit kind of not really having a distinct purpose in the forces of Ered Luin. A cool looking unit but not really one with much substance. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Ered Luin Dragon Slayers, who are the ultimate shock infantry the faction can field. Identical to the previous unit when it comes to armor and officer, these guys are distinguished by their weapons. Massive two-headed axes which are very much inspired by fantasy depictions of axes in the hands of dwarves. These weapons, however, are highly ahistorical as two-handed axes didn't exist in real life. Or rather, two-headed axes didn't exist in real life. Such a weapon having a significant amount of drawbacks were to exist, such as the extra weight that a head that couldn't be used would have, tiring out the warrior using it. That said, the weapon does look cool and fits the unit's aesthetic, axes being the weapons used by the dwarves of the First Age to kill the dragons of the First Dark Lord Morgoth after all. In addition to these massive axes, the unit also uses large crossbows slung over their backs, meaning the unit doubles as shock infantry and ranged infantry, making for a unique mix which due to their amazing armor can withstand enemy volleys in a way that regular shock infantry couldn't, while also returning fire. As a unit, these are the peak of your shock infantry and should be used in the late game as a spear tip of your forces, punching holes in formations with their crossbows before carving them to pieces. An absolutely amazing unit that is emblematic of the Kingdom of Ered Luin's aggressive approach to war. Moving on to the final melee infantry unit the faction can field, we have the Ered Luin Mithril Warriors, who are identical to the Ered Luin Royal Swordsmen in equipment and officer. What sets them apart, however, are their stats, which are significantly higher, most likely as a result of them having either mithril armor, mithril being the rarest and toughest metal in Middle-earth, or being the warriors assigned to guard the faction's mithril reserves, meaning that they're incredibly elite. One thing to note is that mithril is only found under Khazad-dûm, so these dwarves couldn't have been defending mines similar to their Khazad-dûm counterparts. As a unit, these troops are incredibly elite, however generally speaking, other units fielded by the faction should be more than enough for you to take victories without resorting to recruiting these troops. However, if a compact and incredibly elite late-game army is what you want, these guys, combined with the Dragon Slayers, will make for an incredibly formidable force that very few will be able to withstand. With these guys covered, we'll move on to the range units the faction can field, beginning with the Ered Luin Merchant Guard. Equipment-wise, these dwarves lack helmets and instead wear fur caps that resemble the Ushankas used by the Soviet and East German authorities, with a little badge on the front. While these don't really provide head protection, these troops aren't meant to be engaging with enemies directly, so helmets aren't really needed, although they would be appreciated if the worst happens and these troops are forced into melee. For body armor, they wear gambeson, although a few wear mail vests. Good armor for such warriors. For weapons, they use a standard dwarven crossbow that looks like it came straight out of the 15th century. At their sides, they carry the standard dwarven axe in case melee does occur, while slung over their backs they have round shields we've seen before, this being useful both when skirmishing and in melee as it allows them to turn their backs to the enemy to reload without worrying worrying about being shot in the back, shields often being used for this purpose. The officers are identical to the past guard officer, wearing a male hauberk and crested helmet with a crossbow and shield on his back to differentiate him. As a unit, these are your starting range force and are pretty damn good for an early game unit, having an advantage over the skirmishers fielded by other factions in terms of range, allowing them to clear the battlefield of opposition before shooting helpless foes. A very useful unit which adds firepower at a pinch. They shouldn't be used for too long, as there are better units which serve a similar role in mid and late game armies. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Ered Luin Axe Throwers, who were equipped similarly to the previous unit, except that they have helmets we've seen before and use shields and swords in addition to, of course, their axes, while their officers are identical to the Merchant Guard officer, except that he uses a sword and shield rather than a crossbow. As a unit, these guys are another force that you gain access to early on and are intended to see service in beginning armies. However, I view them as inferior to the previous unit due to their lack of range, meaning that they can be killed by opposing equivalent archers and crossbowmen before they can get to throwing their axes, which can be quite devastating. Personally, I keep these guys as a support unit to be used to assist crossbowmen, rather than as the core of my ranged forces when playing as Ered Luin. However, when enemy units are caught out of position, these guys can make mincemeat out of them before taking advantage of the carnage and attacking their flanks and rears. Next up, we have the Ered Luin crossbowmen, who are identical to the Ered Luin warriors, but with shields on their backs and crossbows in their arms, with axes at their side. Skipping the standard officer with his crossbow and shield, these guys are your standard professional ranged force and will see service all the way into the late game, although they are outmatched significantly by the elite archers fielded by men and especially elves. Because of that, it's better not to get into a shootout with such foes, as it'll always go badly for the dwarves, with closing with the enemy being the right call. In mid-game armies, they serve very well, being a linchpin of successfully defending in sieges. Overall, a unit that will be very much a common sight in any army fielded by the Kingdom of Ered Luin after the early game. Finally, we come to the last unit the faction can field, and it's a damn unique one, the Ered Luin Rangers. For armour, these dwarves wear only gambeson, their heads being covered in hooded cloaks rather than helmets, making them very lightly armoured. For weapons, they have a sword, but their main weapon is what sets them apart, recurve bows. Recurve bows are a weapon that has seen widespread use for millennia, especially among steppe people such as the Mongols who use the weapon to great effect. Its small size making it perfect for use on horseback, and in this case making it perfect for the dwarves' smaller stature. Lacking an identifiable officer, these guys are unique in their battlefield role, being equivalent to the rangers fielded by Gondor and the rangers of the north in the Third Age, using guerrilla warfare to kill their foes. These troops are capable of hiding in a variety of locations and being deployed ahead of your armies, making them in effect snipers who can thin out the enemy herd, while also not being too shabby when it comes to melee. However, this unit should not make up the bulk of your ranged forces. They aren't good at absorbing enemy fire in shootouts, being at a disadvantage due to their lack of armor and shields. Instead, much like the throwing axemen, they should be used as a support unit to help bring you one step closer to victory, rather than being battle deciders all on their own. A very cool unit overall, and one which helps delineate just how different this faction is compared to its competitors. With these guys covered, every unit in the faction has been looked at, so let's move on to the faction as a whole. The Kingdom of Ered Luin is a faction that has a very defined playstyle, being an aggressive faction who relies on good to elite infantry to punch holes in enemy lines and finish the fight quickly, a departure from the far more defensive Khazad-dûm faction. Shock infantry and axe infantry are the name of the game when playing as these guys, however they do have some limitations that help balance them out, being somewhat lackluster in the range department as well as entirely lacking cavalry, meaning that swift infantry closing with the enemy is the way to go so as to not be outmaneuvered and run down by horsemen or turned into pincushions by archers. With all that said, my breakdown of the Kingdom of Ered Luin is over, and up until more changes are made to the mod, this will be my last video in my series breaking down the Last Alliance Total Wars factions, although battle videos and army builds should be coming up. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe. It might not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's greatly appreciated. This is your host Jakov, signing out.